Hello, this is Courtney with C. Clark Creative. Thanks for stopping by. Today I'm using one stamp to create two different cards, and I'm cheating a little bit because I am using a couple different sets, but they're all coordinating, so I'm going to count them as one. Hope you don't hold that against me. We're going to start with the center cut hexagon floral background. This is a really cool set because the centerpiece pops out. Now I'm showing you here that it can go back in any orientation, but I feel like it goes back together a little bit better in its original orientation. So I just took a Sharpie and made a little mark so that I can always quickly get it placed back together. So I'm putting some Repositionable adhesive on the back of my Neenah Desert Storm cardstock here and getting it put down on my Misti. I'm going to align that center hexagon and then place the rest of the stamp around it. That helps me get quick and easy way to get the background centered. So I'm going to ink this up with Gina K Kraft ink. I'm going to stamp this a few times until I get a good impression. I did stamp twice, and then we'll use an adhesive eraser to remove all of that repositionable adhesive from the back of the card. Next is going to come the hexagon greetings, which is basically sentiments that match along with these hexagons. They are, the hexagon stamp is, or die cut is what can be used on this background stamp, but it also cuts out all of these sentiments. This is kind of why I'm keeping them all together. But I'm stamping this also in Kraft, and that's just on a Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm rubbing that stamp a little bit just because that particular sentiment hasn't been used before. And I did notice after stamping that my microfiber towel actually left some fibers on my stamp. So what I do is I clean it with the Gina K Tidy Towel really well, and then stamp again on the opposite side of that card panel and get a much better impression. So that's the one that I end up die cutting for the card a little bit later. So I wanted to do a little bit of Copic coloring, but because these images are small, I like to just do a very simple coloring over the entire thing. So colors I used were RV66, BG45, YG09, R85, V04, and Y18. Just did a simple coloring. I basically did two colors on that rose flower just because could not see in between. It would look like a big blob if I just did it all in one color, just because I did stamp tone on tone with my ink color. So I added two colors, help that out. So I've got my hexagon die cut here, and I'm just trimming down this card panel a little bit. What I'm trimming it to is 5 1/8 by 3 7/8, and I just like the border it gives me when I put that on the A2 card frame. You can see it right there, and I felt like that would help that sentiment tie in a little bit better rather than having that card panel full size. Just a little bit of Scotch foam tape on the back here, and then Distress Collage Medium is what I'm using today to glue this panel down onto the A2 card base that I cut from more Neenah cardstock. It is 110 pound. So I'm popping up the sentiment, and then I'm going to pull out some Nuvo drops just to add a little bit of pizzazz to this card. My colors of crystal drops are Moroccan red and party pink, which does sound like a very interesting mix, but it happened to match the colors of my flower there in the middle pretty well. I just had a scratch piece of that Kraft cardstock and with a Neenah Desert Storm, I guess, cardstock, and tested a few different samples of Nuvo drops, and decided these colors work pretty well. Didn't use a lot, just a few, just to add a little bit of interest in some random areas. And then this first card is complete. Few taps, just helps the Nuvo drop settle, and then I'm going to set that aside for a day just to let it cure up. All right, on to the second card. Starting off with a card panel cut from Canson XL watercolor paper. It is a little bit larger just because I get the 9x12, I think it is, and then just cut it in 4 so that I can always have a lot of extra space on my watercolor panels, and then I trim it down. So stamping, aligned this the same way, put that center hexagon and then the rest of the stamp around it, but then I went ahead and removed that center stamp because I don't need it though this time. I'm going to trim that out a little bit later. So we're putting some Ranger white embossing powder on this. I really like Ranger embossing powders. That's what I use for all my base colors: gold, copper, black, white, all of that. So we're going to heat set this with the Wagner heat tool. I had a heat tool for 15-20 years and it finally died on me, so I got this new one and it works pretty good. I feel like my older one was quicker at the heat up, but I do like that the Wagner tool has a high and low. So I'm just showing you my Epicurean cutting board here that I have taped down my watercolor panel onto. Now this is watercolor paper, or the tape is painter's tape that I use, but I use it over and over, so it's not very sticky anymore. But we'll see a little bit later where I did have a little bit of watercolor still on that tape that started to bleed in a little bit, and it wasn't a color that I was actually using. So you see me blot that up a little bit. We'll see if you can actually see it. But all I'm doing here is just picking a few colors and just basically plopping it down in a few places, staying random with it. That's my preferred watercolor technique, is just to throw some color down, add some water. I tend to add way too much water, and I have very soupy watercolor, so I end up removing water and then I end up adding water. It's just how I like to watercolor. You do you. As you can see me getting up some of that extra color. I guess you can't see it, but that is what I'm doing there. Adding some water just to get those colors to move a little bit. I'm using similar colors. They're both cool tones, so they're not going muddy yet. I am going to throw in another color here that can definitely go muddy, but I'm trying to be careful with it. I'm creating a bit of an orange here, so I'm getting some yellow down, adding a little bit of red, just because this palette doesn't have an orange, which I thought was kind of interesting, but easy enough to make one. So I really liked how the tomatoey red of this kind of contrasted with those two cool tones a little bit. So it is a cooler kind of an orange color, but it is still a bit warmer than these other two. So that's where I try to keep it to a minimum. You'll see me add some more here in a little bit. I will dry the panel, add some more green and yellow. This is how I watercolor, really loose. No particular way, rhyme or reason why I do a drawing, or it's just kind of my intuition, and I get panels that I like at the end, so it works for me. So adding then this purple here, this is the purple that I will end up stamping my sentiment with. I really liked how this purple kind of popped through when the panel dried, just because with watercolors they do lighten up as they dry, and this purple just looked really good peeking through, and I had a Gina K ink that matched it perfectly, so that worked out quite well for me. Darkening up some of that green a little bit. And just trying to brighten up a little bit of that yellow. And get a little bit more movement out of that. One of the reasons I love watercolor is just how kind of has a mind of its own. Try to control it a little bit, but for the most part just kind of let it do its thing, and for as long as I don't overwork it, which I want to do, I have to kind of force myself to stop, but I tend to really like the panels I end up with. So there we go. We're going to let that one dry completely before I center cut that hexagon. So there we are. Now what I'm doing here is just looking at the actual die cut to see where that line is on the inside. Sometimes they can be offset a little bit. So I was just looking to see how it was centered. So I knew if I could just center that panel or if I needed to offset it a little bit. So there we go. I'm going to trim this panel down. I'm going to trim it to the same size as my other cards panel, a 5 1/8 by 3 7/8. It's just kind of my go-to single matting situation. Sometimes I'll go a little bit different if I want a little bit bigger or a little bit less, but this tends to be my go-to size for a card panel. So there's my card base, and what I'm going to do is set this up on my Misti to help align my stamp. There we are, the lavender fields. Oh, it was Altenew, not Gina K. I've already forgotten. That lavender fields is like the perfect purple. But what I'm doing is I'm lining this. I have not adhered that top card panel yet. I'm adhering my sentiment stamp, transferring it to the lid, and moving that card panel so that I can get a good clear stamp right onto the card base. I'm going to ink this up a few times just to make sure I get nice bold color. Going to get that put away. And then just to add a little bit of dimension, I'm going to pop up this panel above, just so you get the sentiment set back a little bit. So I'm pulling out the trusty Scotch tape again. I've been on a Scotch tape kick lately. Sometimes I'll take my Kraft foam and I'll die cut it and back it, but I was just filling the Kraft foam lately. So pretty easy. Just filling that all in, centering that visually, placing it over. And then what I'm doing is pulling out some crystals that I have. Now I think this isn't available anymore, but basically it's a set called Swan Lake from Little Things, and it has white and it has kind of a holographic sequin, which I went with. I didn't even use any of the white. I just liked the holographic, and that finished the second card off. So here we go. First card, second card, 2 cards, 1 stamp set-ish. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon.